So here I'm going to help you work out muscle actions. And if you remember, we had a few rules. The first was that for most of the body, until the knee, any muscle crossing in front will cause flexion of that joint, and any muscle crossing behind the joint will cause extension. So, and from the knee, this rule changes. So let's take a look at these muscles. This is the biceps, the brachialis, and this muscle is the brachioradialis. As you can see, all three of them are crossing the elbow joint. And let's see their action. So they're crossing anterior or in front of the joint. So if you look here, you can see how when they contract and shorten, they flex the joint. Here, let's look at a muscle which crosses in front of the neck. So you can see, again, flexing the neck. So look at this, crossing in front of the neck, flexing the neck. Here are tendons crossing in front of the wrist, again, flexing the wrist. Here, look at the muscles crossing in front of the trunk or vertebral column. Notice how they are flexing the vertebral column. So the rectus abdominis here principally does that, as well as the obliques up here. Here, let's look at muscles which cross behind the joint. So here, for example, trapezius and all these muscles crossing behind the vertebral column, the cervical portion. Notice how when they contract, they cause extension. Let's look at another one. So here, when the elbow is flexed, as you can see, the triceps, which crosses behind the elbow, notice how it would be stretched. Now, when this muscle contracts and shortens, notice how it's going to straighten out the elbow. So see this principle, crossing behind the joint, causing extension. Here we have these tendons which are crossing behind the joint, and they will cause extension. Notice at this point where the wrist is flexed, these tendons are stretched. Now when they contract and shorten, notice how they are going to cause extension of this joint. Same principle holds good in the lower limb. So these are muscles until the hip. So the hip joint uses the same principles. Muscles crossing in front will cause flexion. Any muscle crossing behind will cause extension. So let's look at these muscles. The iliopsoas crossing in front of the hip joint. So notice how when this muscle contracts, it causes flexion. So you can look at it from the side. So this is straight. Now when the muscle contracts, look at how it's going to cause flexion at the hip joint. Here, let's look at these muscles which cross behind the hip joint, like the gluteus maximus, the hamstring muscles. So when they contract, they are going and shorten. See, they are going to cause extension of the hip joint. So you can see this rule applies till the hip, all over the body until the hip. From the knee downwards, the rule changes. Any muscle crossing behind will cause flexion, but a muscle crossing in front will cause extension. So this applies to the knee as well as the ankle. Any muscle crossing behind will cause flexion, only we don't call it flexion, we call it plantar flexion. Any muscle crossing in front will cause extension, which is called dorsiflexion. So let's take a look at these muscles, which are the hamstrings up here and the gastrocnemiae, both of which cross the knee posteriorly. So let's take a look here. So here again, notice these muscles, when they contract, they cause flexion of the knee joint. Again, these muscles like gastrocnemiae and soleus, when they are crossing behind the ankle, in this case, you can see they will cause plantar flexion, which is pointing your toes downwards because they pull on the calcaneus. So here, let's look at knee extension. So muscles crossing in front of the knee, and then we'll also look at dorsiflexion. So in this case, you can see the knee is flexed, which would be by the muscles crossing behind. And this muscle, which is crossing in front, is stretched. Now, if this were to contract and shorten, notice how it's going to straighten the knee out. So it's going to cause extension. And here, let's look at muscles which cross in front of the ankle. So these will be dorsiflexors. So notice how when they contract, they will and shorten, they will cause your toes to point upwards. So they cause dorsiflexion. And so we can see it again. So they contract, they cause dorsiflexion. Let's look at the next rule, which is when muscles cross from medial to lateral. So they have a medial attachment on the axial skeleton. The lateral attachment is on the appendicular skeleton. So this one is showing you the region of the shoulder, and this is the pectoralis major muscle. This rule holds true for the lower limb also. So when it's attached, as we will see in a little while, medially and going laterally, when this, you can see here, the shoulder is abducted. So this muscle is stretched. Now look and see what happens when it contracts. It pulls the arm closer to the side of the body, which is it causes adduction. So we can turn this around a little bit. So you can see it when it shortens, it pulls the arm closer to the side of the body. This is true whether the muscle is in front or posteriorly. Let's watch this at the hip joint, again, from medial to lateral attachment. So you can see this is the appendicular skeleton, part of the axial skeleton. These are the adductor group of muscles. When they contract, notice they pull the limb closer to the midline, which is adduction. For abduction, the rule is the muscle has to be attached on the lateral aspect of the joint, and the two main joints we usually talk of are the shoulder and the hip. So it has to be attached on the lateral aspect of the joint going from proximal to distal. So here you can see this deltoid muscle. When this contracts, notice how it's going to pull the humerus up and cause abduction. And the same for the lower limb. So muscle attached on the lateral aspect of the joint from proximal to distal. Notice how when this contracts, it will cause abduction. So you can see the principle holds true for both upper and lower limbs. For rotation, all muscles which cross in front of a joint at those joints which allow rotation, they will cause medial rotation. As you can see, pectoralis major here is going to rotate it medially. And muscles which cross lateral to the joint will cause lateral rotation. So watch these muscles which are crossing lateral to the joint as well as up here. So this causes lateral rotation. So you can see that these are the general principles which you should use to learn muscle actions.